Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, where are we? It's so wonderful to see so many people here tonight. I'm welcoming you to the 13th annual Summer Tony Woiak Festival, History Festival, all those words. And you have to think about how to say that, because the first years that we had the Tony Woiak festivals, it was just in the winter. We thought people needed something to do in the middle of the deep, dark winter. And then they became kind of popular, and we decided, let's see if people will come in the summer, and they've been coming for 13 years. So we've got 13 seasons, 4 in the winter, 4 in the summer, so you can do the math. Minus a few programs during the COVID years. So we thank our audience for continuing to support us and to hang out and come and listen to local history. And I think when you tell people that 75 or 100 people have shown up on a Tuesday night to watch history, they're like, really? Uh-huh. But it's more than that, isn't it? You have to come to find out, but because it's you, the audience, that make this a lot more fun. You know, the speakers are wonderful, but your enthusiasm, your welcoming, your great questions, your comments at the end are all part of what makes it fun. Plus, the harbor table, which used to be the steak pit and all those other iterations in between, has always been such a welcoming place. And so part of coming to Tony Woiak festivals is hanging out beforehand and hanging out afterward for a little bit. One change this season is that the Harbor View is open for dinner on Tuesday nights. We've always had the place kind of to ourselves on presentation nights, but so this is the first night we're trying that out, and so we encourage you to support them. They've been really good to us. They do all the setup, and they answer a lot of questions and get things done. So let me get on. I want to let you know that this is presented. 2 local organizations work in partnership on the Tony Woiak festivals. One is the Washburn Area Historical Society, which runs also the museum in town. The other organization is the Washburn Heritage Association. And I can also let you know that there are a lot of volunteers that make this happen. We want to thank them. One very special man is Andrew Grimm, who is back with a video recorder. All of the Tony Woiaks, not quite from the beginning, have been video recorded and are available at the library in Washburn, also at the museum, and they're on our website. So you can go back, find one you missed, or find one you want to watch again. And let's see. I think I've said thank you to everybody I need to. One more other thing we're going to try a little differently this year. When we get to the part of the program where there are questions at the end, usually the speaker will remain at the podium or up in this area, and people just kind of, you know, after the general questions, people will just kind of come forward and talk with him here for as long as you both can. Have the patience for that. But there's a concern about breaking down all this wonderful AV equipment that we were just able to buy for our group last year. So we don't want anybody tripping, and we don't want anything getting pulled over either. So what we thought might be safer, tonight when the mic is all finished and the program's over with and all the general questions have been asked, he will just be reminded to move to the back, and we'll leave this front area so that we can get to work packing things away. So that's all the nuts and bolts. Welcome once again. And I'd like to introduce at this point the president of the Washburn Heritage Association, Mary Gruel, and Mary is going to introduce our speaker for the night. Thanks.
Welcome. How many of you are here for the first time? Oh, wow. Exciting. Keep coming this summer. We have 3 more following and some very lovely ones. Wonderful. Well, I have the honor to introduce Mike Bunch, but I want to tell you a few things about him. You okay, Mike, with that? All right. Well, Mike wears many hats. As a professional, he was an engineer. Today, as a retired Bayview resident, he's pursuing two of his major interests he has had for years, that being trains and genealogy. Makes sense, right? What we're going to see today. So as a member of the Bayview History Committee, which is part of the Washburn Heritage Association, Mike has spent the past 5 years using his very extensive workshop and engineering experience or expertise to help restore many of the items we have around Houghton Depot. How many of you have been to Houghton Depot? If you have not, everything that's outside has Mike's touch to it. This includes the Fairmont speeder and the push cart, the baggage cart, the Houghton Depot sign, the whistle post, and on and on and on. He even put wheels under our female mannequin so we could move her around much more easily. Yay. For those of you who have visited the depot, he also helped to design the infrastructure of the train set that comes down. How many of you have seen that? If not, go see it this summer during open house. When we have students, at the end, the train set comes down. It's a model of a 1913 Houghton village, and the train goes around and the kids blow whistles. Very cool. And that's all been done with Paul Johnson as well. His other interest is genealogy. Mike delved into this field years before internet was available, so we know how old you are now. Spending hours at the State Historical Society in Madison looking for the needle in the haystack. So when Mike happened to be chatting with Jerry Phillips, and Jerry mentioned the Orphan Trains, well, Mike's curiosity was piqued. And he began a search to find out more about this train that came to Bayfield with orphan children. And if you happen to stop by his house, you will find his desk loaded with books about the Orphan Train. So he has done a fantastic job researching something many of us have never heard about. Anybody here ever heard about the Orphan Trains? Ooh, a few of you. Wonderful. Well, you'll learn a lot more tonight. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mike Bunch.
Thank you, Mary. That was a little over the top, but that's fine. This is a slide, a general slide of the History Festival. And I would give special thanks to Jenny Peterson and all the other organizers of the History Festivals. If anyone wants to know more about the Orphan Trains, there are about 15 copies of a document available at the end of my presentation. They're on the table where you came in and handed over your $5. There's about 15 copies there. I feel very, very privileged to be able to present this story. I will be talking about almost all slides. I may not read everything, but leave it up to you, the audience, to do that. I may comment on individual slides and point out significant statements or parts of slides. All of these people shown played very important roles in this presentation, especially Jerry Phillips, who first told me of the Orphan Train movement and described the Rabideaus and their connections to the Petersons and the Redcliffe tribe. Jerry is just behind me, and Jerry, would you stand up and wave? Mary touched on this a little bit. My personal interest in the adoption topic. As the slide shows, this represents that personal interest. My wife Paula was adopted at birth. She was always curious about her actual parents. She found documents describing who her mother was. We met Jean in Chicago in the Hancock building above the railroad tracks from Indiana. It was an important and heartwarming meeting. Later we met all of Paula's half-sisters and brother. Paula's brother and sister were at our house when she died. My daughter Leslie has taken a keen interest in genealogy, and as the slide shows, found a cousin who sent her this picture of Paula's mother. Or the picture of Paula's father, excuse me, the one on the left. And some of you who know Paula see a very definite resemblance. He came from Sicily to the United States. Charles Brace has been credited with initiating the Orphan Train movement. I'll read this important statement. When a child of the street stands before you in rags with a tear-stained face, you cannot easily forget him, and yet you are perplexed what to do. The human soul is difficult to interfere with. You hesitate how far you should go.
My mother.
This is Elizabeth Humphrey. Elizabeth's life is a very important part of this story, as the slide describes. Elizabeth's life and story would become one of the few successes of the nation's orphan train movement. This is her official birth certificate. We got these documents from the Rabideaus. They both called me before the presentation and said they'd been working outside all day and they just couldn't make it. But they're a big part of this whole presentation and this whole record. Elizabeth was born in 1900, as it says. But if you tip the birth certificate sideways, it also states that Elizabeth Humphrey was her mother. And it was my feeling, a sad feeling, that only thing the elder Elizabeth had to give her daughter was her name. Both the father and mother are mentioned in this document. Whether or not Elizabeth was an orphan could be in question. About 50% of the children were not orphans, and the status of many of these children was unknown. Elizabeth was, at some point, separated from both parents, making her an orphan who, at 12 years old, boarded a train bound for Bayfield, Wisconsin. It's very touching to me, as shown in the slide, that the only thing she had to give her daughter was her name. This is a very important explanation of the Orphan Train story. The orphan trains moved 200,000 to 230,000 children. Not all orphans were placed in loving situations, and it's a heartbreaking fact that some orphans were separated from their brothers or sisters in New York City and put on separate trains. This shows conditions for orphans in the 1800s and the fact that they were heartbreaking. Poverty, epidemics, alcoholism, and deplorable living conditions left many families unable to provide for their children. Unscrupulous business practices resulted in child labor, minimal pay, and petty crime rings. This slide shows several examples of posters placed for orphan children. As it says, some were even placed at depot stations. This is a very graphic photo of some orphans' living conditions. A very important topic here, the socioeconomic, political, and ideological factors of the Orphan Train movement. I'll let you read this slide for just a little bit.
For those of us in back, can you read it? It's a little hard for us.
Sure. During the 1850s, parents and families fell victim to poverty, insufficient housing, and dismal working conditions of the time. There were thousands of children living on the streets of major eastern cities trying to survive, others trying to provide for their destitute parents and siblings. In search of food, shelter, and money, children sold rags, matches, and newspapers. Life on the street was dangerous. They formed gangs for protection and petty theft when hungry. Police often arrested them, some as young as 5. They were put in adult facilities with adult criminals. Protestant evangelicalism was the dominant ideology of the United States, playing a role in nation building and internal expansion. Manifest destiny was the belief that American settlers were destined to expand westward across North America. There was a strong vision of the frontier as a promised land and a belief in a God-given, sanctified right to conquer the land. We'll talk a little bit more about that manifest destiny in the slide further on. It also says, none believed more than Charles Brace in the virtues of westward expansion, often preaching that the idyllic and pure life was to be found in the Midwest and Western territories, where good Protestant Christian folks working God's farmland would create in these children the obedience, work ethic, and ultimately provide the needed redemption of their souls. One significant statement is that life was dangerous on the streets. And I won't read my comments because I just read the whole thing here. And this is a manifest destiny that the Americans believed they should own all the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, coast to coast. This is a very important concept. Manifest destiny was the belief that Americans were ordained, in effect, Native Americans. They believed that because the Native Americans didn't believe in the biblical tales that we did, that it was okay to take their land. Railroads were exceptionally important for the development of the entire U.S. For the first time ever, goods and materials could be shipped to any part of the United States, and in a speedy and safe way. As the slide says, Grace could take children on the railroad for $30 to $50 per child. There will be some general pictures of the orphan trains here. These maps tell a very important story about the whole U.S., but more importantly for us, Wisconsin, where 2,750 orphans were placed. There were many train tracks in most of the U.S. and lower Wisconsin, but only one track going to Bayfield. The tip of the arrow shows the railroad track from Ashland to Bayfield. The blue line here shows the location of the Omaha Railroad Depot. In an unusual irony, across the street from the train depot is the Last Chance Saloon. Abuse was, in fact, a very high occurrence. Yes, some orphans were sexually abused. What was good intention at the time became a horrible result, the sending of girls off to a lifetime of sexual abuse. I'll let you read this first. Can the people in the rear read this?
No.
I'll just read it again. Time hasn't faded for 77-year-old Harold Williams' memory of leaving New York City along with the other orphans on a train, taking them to new homes in the Midwest. I remember standing on the platform and then going into the train and sitting down with my teddy bear in my lap, he said. I recall looking out the window and seeing all of the people and the buildings. Many orphaned or abandoned children benefited from the orphan train movement, which lasted from 1854 to 1929. Others merely had their suffering relocated. Their tales, good and bad, were told in an orphan train reunion attended by about 24 people who took part in the unusual social experiment that sent more than 100,000 children to foster homes far from the big city. In 1929, me and my twin brother were put on the last orphan train out to Canvas, said Alan Bankston, 64, of Dayton, Ohio. We wound up with adoptive parents, he said. They gave us everything we needed except love, and love is what we needed the most. This one is a little difficult for me to read too. But I'll just say that, yes, orphans became indentured slaves who suffered physical abuse and frequent beatings. This abuse was undocumented, and some children were not permitted to become an actual part of the family. I'll read this whole thing again too, since you can't see it in the rear. The orphan train movement was embedded within some of America's greatest changes in views regarding childhood development and laws affecting children and families. Over time, complaints were lodged against Children's Aid Society and New York Foundling Hospital, resulting in states creating laws restricting the placement of children within their states. There is minimal evidence of the orphan train movement as a positive driving force in modern adoption and foster care practices. Rather, many of these reforms came about to specifically oppose orphan train and similar practices. The need for orphan train movement decreased as legislation was passed providing in-home family support. State and local governments funded foster care for orphans, while compulsory education and anti-child labor statutes were always also being passed. In 1910, when major efforts were underway to limit child labor, 72% of children ages 10 to 15 were employed in agriculture. And the reference here is see Forrest Chester Ensign, Athens Press, 1921. With the changing agricultural landscape and the impending Great Depression, labor demand decreased. With the railroad expansion complete, railroads ended subsidized fares provided to charities. And as it said, there are about 2 million descendants of the orphan trains now living in the United States. This is from an article from the Sioux Falls newspaper. As it says, a carload of these children were given to Poles discrimination, with no adoption proceedings taken, and the members of the board consider this to be a menace to the state, and an effort will be made to stop this practice. Again, I'll read the whole thing. In 1909, Theodore Roosevelt and child welfare leaders held the White House Conference in support of the Mother's Pension movement, which was the predecessor of welfare as we know it. This movement advocated that children should not be removed from their homes solely due to poverty. Indeed, the pensions resulting from this conference were only available to widowed and primarily white mothers, not to women of color, mothers with children born out of wedlock, divorced or abandoned mothers. This was a significant ideological shift from focusing on the sins of the parents to viewing the family unit as something important to the needs of the children and of society at large. Social work and community well-being were developing into formal disciplines of education and training, and with that came a greater appreciation for the broader socioeconomic conditions that created hardships for even the best of parents. It was thought that perhaps aligning policy and charity with the needs of the family would allow children to remain safely within their home environment. Legal, social work, and policy historians conclude that the orphan train movement was one of many similar efforts to deal with unwanted or problematic children. But like other policies and charities with agendas apart from the needs of only the children, it met its demise as social and political movements worked to eliminate indentured servitude, child labor, occupational hazards, and the ending of a policy of criminalizing rather than help lift people from charity. To me, and the statement that they were available only to widowed and primarily white mothers, not to women of color, mothers with children born out of wedlock, divorced or abandoned mothers, shows the horrible discrimination at that time. Jane Addams played a pivotal role in the triumphant advocacy for the creation of a juvenile court system, enhanced regulations on municipal cleanliness in factories, safeguarding labor rules for women, and the expansion of playgrounds and kindergartens around Chicago. Addams was a founding member of the National Child Labor Committee in 1907, which oversaw the federal child labor law enactment in 1916. Addams spearheaded the effort to open a school of social work at the University of Chicago, establishing institutional backing for the emerging field. Jane Addams was an incredible woman who advocated for a juvenile court system. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Peace Prize. And just as we know, the orphan train that brought Elizabeth came to Wisconsin and came to Bayfield. This is one of the important facts of our story. The Bayfield train station. We can't see it now, it's disappeared. But it was a large train station with many related facilities. We can thank Bob Nelson for these pictures of the trains and station in Bayfield. This is a wonderful model of the Bayfield train station and surrounding areas. It's found downstairs in the Bayfield Heritage Association building. It was made a long time ago, and it was rebuilt and installed with much work and great care. This is really an incredible project and an incredible picture. The train depot was located here and had a turntable for redirecting train cars. This is the location and what's left of the turntable foundation. The turntable is still visible in this vacant lot in Bayfield, and it's on the corner of 2nd Street and Manypenny Avenue. Elizabeth grew up in the Bayfield area. She didn't talk about her former life in New York City. She grew up, got married, and had children of her own who said that when they ventured out, their mother, according to her son Alan Rabideau, always insisted on knowing exactly where they were and who they were with. Elizabeth, from her very early childhood, learned to be aware of and very protective of her own children. Elizabeth grew up in the Bayfield area, got married, and became the mother of 9 children, including Alan Rabideau. This is a picture of Alan speaking to some of our committee.
So, my name is Alan Rabideau, and my mother came over to this country on an orphan train back in the 90s, way back then. And the nuns from an orphanage took all these young people and they put them on a big train and they brought them into this country here. And then people used to pick them up for their home, or the boys and that, they put them off the fields to work. And then, I don't know where. And my mother and her stepsister is what they came over to this up here where we live now in Bayfield, Wisconsin, in Redcliffe. That's on a reservation. And the lady out there, she adopted my mother and her sister. And they lived here all these years. My mother, when she was older, she got married to my dad. He came from over in Odina. That's over in their country over there where all the Indians live over there in that part of the country. And her dad, that lady, he had a great big farm over there in Bayfield, and that's where he lived there. And then, other than that, and then I think I'm repeating myself, I think. These two girls, they got together and they came on orphanage, and my mother went down there and she took them over there. And after she met my dad, and they got married there, and the Petersons, she got married. I know about it, I don't know what else I can tell you.
This actually is a very historically important video from Alan Rabideau. And this was Mary Jo Rabideau. I can get him to run.
I was born downtown where the building that sits across from the hotel, it's got the Howl in it, the store downstairs. Well, at that time, in 1941, they had a midwife type of hospital. The doctor would come in, the mothers would have their babies, and they'd stay there for 2 weeks. And then they would come home. And so my mother, one of her best friends was pregnant also, and they both were due at the same time. But each of them wanted the front window so that they could look out for 2 weeks. So they were kind of wondering who would be first. Well, I was first. So I was born in March 15th, and then Pulaski, which is Andy's Market downtown, that was the one that was born 2 weeks later, so she did get the front also. So I think we're the only two that probably have been actually born downtown in Bayfield.
Another very important Mary Jo at the Rabideau house. Sisters Anna and Elizabeth Peterson. Anna was also adopted separately from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This is an older picture of Elizabeth Peterson, who married Frank Rabideau. This again was given to us by the Rabideaus. Elizabeth was born in 1900 in New York City. We don't know anything about her first 12 years. She never talked about it. She boarded a train at the age of 12 and headed somewhere west. She arrived in Bayfield, Wisconsin, and was adopted by the Peterson family. She was finally happy, and she prospered. She grew up and married and had children of her own, among whom was Alan Rabideau. To say that she changed her life was an understatement. She died and was buried in the St. Francis Cemetery in Red Cliff. I can only say, as I finish this remarkable story, rest in peace, Elizabeth. And that's the end of the story.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that wonderful, wonderful story. And as is usual, we can spend a little time asking questions, extra questions, before everybody gets up to move. I do have a handheld mic, which it helps a lot. If you think you have a loud enough voice, you might, but people sitting behind you don't always hear. So if you'll raise your hand, I can, if you have any comments or any questions, here we go.
I'm the youngest daughter of Elizabeth and Frank Rabideau. There was 9 of us children, and mostly all living in Wisconsin. Down in Phillips and Rice Lake area and up and through here. But my mother didn't talk much about her life, and I don't know why, but and another thing is, Annie, her sister, was not really her sister. She was also came on the orphan train, but she was picked up along the way. And she kind of took my mother in her care. And when the Petersons lady said, I want this child, my aunt said, you can't have her unless you take me too. So my aunt, we called her Aunt Annie all our lives, we all did. But she wasn't really, really our aunt. She was also adopted on the way. But my mother always said she had a wonderful life with the Petersons, and she never, ever regretted her family that adopted her.
Any other questions or comments? Here's one up front.
How were children connected to families? Did they have that before the children arrived at a particular place, or did they bring them hoping families would choose them? Do you know?
I think they brought them to places hoping that they would be chosen. Nobody knew ahead of time where they were going, nor did the people in the town know who was coming.
Thank you. Mike, I don't know, I'd be curious for your information, but it was my understanding that there were two kinds of orphan trains. The Protestant, as you mentioned his name, started it, that's true. And my understanding was that he put all these kids on a train and literally just, at every stop, anyone could have a child. And you just signed up and signed off and took this child, and next train, then you go to the next stop until they got all the kids given out. And it was also, on the good side of this, it's my understanding that there were two governors that were actually on these orphan trains and out west. So that was really nice to hear. Then the other train setup was the, you mentioned it, the hospital, founding hospital, was the Catholic train group. And it was my understanding that that was more organized, and that they sent out letters to all of the Catholic churches and asked who might take a child. And so they then had this list of who wanted a child. And so the correct number of kids would come, and they would all, I'd heard that the name of the parents they were going to was sewn into their collar of their little outfits. And the kids that came to Bayfield were almost all very young, under 5, I believe, down to 2 to 5. And so they were, I think it was 34, but somewhere in that range of kids came to Bayfield. The odd thing I found was that I don't believe there were any given off in Ashland. No one was selected. And I don't believe there were any in Washburn either. That all of these went only to Bayfield. Now, I don't understand why, whether the priest didn't even read it in the community and therefore didn't have any. I mean, I don't, it's very unusual. That would be fun. Interesting to find that out, Mike, why that happened in that way. So they all actually did have assigned families. There was also another very unfortunate fact, and that is that, to my understanding, every single one of the parents who agreed to take a child, every single one of them was Native. Wow. That there were no white people who took any children. So it sounded rather racist, because I believe the inclination and insinuation was that they thought that these were going to be very unsavory children. And so the surprise when these kids arrived, between ages of 2 to 5, these beautiful children, they were all exceedingly surprised in Bayfield to see that. And there was a lot of trouble, actually, that then ensued as a result. And the white people started making trouble. But anyway, that's a part of that story. And then, as I understand it, there was also, and I don't know if you can verify this, Mike, or it would be fun to look this up, find this, but I understood that there was an extra child. And because they were very concerned with these 34 or whatever, that there might be a loss on the route. And so they had an extra little child. And but luckily they all were safe and healthy and made the whole long trip. And so they then asked if there was someone who might wish this last child. And the story goes that there was a couple that were childless. They could not have children. And the story goes that the woman, the wife, pushed her husband aggressively in the back to get up there in the front and get this little child. And the story goes that as he came sort of stumbling up to the train depot, this little girl yelled, "Daddy," and jumped into his arms. And I always have felt that when I make the movie, that's where I'm going to start. Thank you.
Anyone else have something to share? This is where it gets interesting, isn't it? Yes.
Jerry, I don't think we have any records of someone as young as 2 being on the orphan train. The Rabideaus, I think, did make the comment that their orphan train had nuns on it, and that the nuns came back a year later to check up on the orphans and see how they were being treated. As far as Native American, we don't have any record of their all being Native Americans. There are certainly lots of Petersons in the Red Cliff area, so there were Native Americans, and from what we could see, it wasn't. Mrs. Peterson was related to Native Americans, but it wasn't all Native Americans in that group. So that's my understanding. And maybe you can answer more of that question too.
My mother said that there was other Native American people there and white people, but there was 4 of them that was taken, not counting my aunt, but there was, and they all lived in the settlement area, the cornucopia area. One was the Charlo. My mother said there was the Marado, but she thought that he was adopted Marado. That wasn't his, first name. That when he was adopted, he took the name of the Marado. And I don't know which Marado that would be or anything like that. But there was other children besides my mother, and I thought she said there was like 7 children that got off the train there and that were taken by families. I had a visit from Mr. Kidder about 15 years ago when he was writing a story, and he wanted to know about my mother. And I had a tape that my mother had taken from the Red Cliff people had asked her questions and stuff about, and she talked about her childhood and how she loved being with the people she was with, what a good life she had. But this Mr. Kidder, we talked for a long time. He wanted a lot of information, and we talked as much as, and he said that so many children that he tracked were either abused, ran away, never stayed with the people they were adopted to, or he said there was just a lot of abuse and stuff with the children. And a lot of them were used as slaves on a farm, doing all the farm work and doing a lot of work, so, but he said a lot of them were also happy children. So I guess we're glad they all made it. But, yeah, my mother was said to be a happy woman.
All right, if there are no more comments or questions at this time, oh, we've got one more.
Were all of the children placed, or when they came to the end of the line, if there were children still on the train, did they make the return trip?
My understanding is that there were no children that had to be sent back.
Yeah, I thought so too, that they all got off. Either Ashland or Bayfield.
I think that in what I understood too, there were various situations that didn't work out, or like you say, they were not treated well. The Catholic group were, as Mike said, were much more involved with this process. And not only the next year did they come back, they were checked on a regular basis. Well, I don't know if that meant every year or every, and they had to actually, these kids, these children, had to write something, I think, each year, which had to go to the church, so that they knew how they were and how they were being treated. They were trying to, really be careful about that. And that there were, in those cases, some of them that were then taken out of a situation or wherever and then taken elsewhere, often in Wisconsin, but sometimes a fair distance away, and replaced, yeah.
Okay, and then we've got one more in the back, I think, and then we'll call it Dave.
I'd address a couple of things that were brought up about the two different trains. The Brace's efforts began in 1856, and by 1900, the New York Founding Hospital, which was Catholic, by the way, and Brace being an evangelical Lutheran, was very, very much against Catholicism and felt that that was not going to sort of save the inept and the soulless in the city that he saw as a problem. But he was also a practical man, and as were the Catholics at the hospital. And what you're talking about, the second train, it was often called the baby train. And that train, they used the orphan trains. They worked together for a short period of time with Brace and the railroad, which at that time was expanding and offering subsidized fares. And New York Founding Hospital, you're right, they were a bit more organized in the sense that what they did, primarily because their orphans were much, much younger. So a lot of those kids were placed in adoptive situations. So when they were formally adopted, that had been something that had been prearranged. So a lot of times parents would write the hospital and say, yeah, I'd like a child who's got brown curly hair and one who appears to be sort of smart, but no more than 5 years old, et cetera, et cetera. And then the hospital would look through their records and look at the children and say, okay, we've got one that meets that description. And that's how they did have, they did one additional thing with checking on the children than the other. And you have to understand, being back in these days, this idea that there was a proper follow-up was pretty much non-existent. In terms of today's terms, but back then, what New York Founding Hospital did was they would have authentic, I don't know, but they would write them, and there were efforts that were made initially as well as later to send what they called a guardian or a nun back to the placement and check to see how things were. It didn't happen as it should have on a regular basis, but considering what little resources they had, the fact that it happened at all was pretty remarkable. And I also wonder, in regards to the situation about, the question about the Native American, or the indigenous children, there was a situation that was right at the end of, right before 1929, where Arizona, the state of Arizona, was to receive a bunch of kids, or the train was, actually this is another prearranged situation, coming from New York to Arizona, and the nuns weren't really aware of the racial tension or some of the demographics that they were walking into. And what they did was, they left these white children with, I think there was a Hispanic Indian mix of families that lived in the area, and they took these children in as their own children. Well, when the white folks realized that their children that they thought they would be receiving went to the Mexican Indian families, they're all hell broke loose. They did everything except, create like almost like a kind of a bounty hunting. They all got together, they band together one night, and they went in very secretly and quietly into the Mexican native homes, and they took the children. Every single one of the children they took back and brought into their homes. So I think that might have been part of what somebody was mentioning. And yes, Kidder, Mr. Kidder, Clark Kidder is probably we know he's the leading national expert, might be the international expert on the orphan train movement. And much of what she had said regarding Mr. Kidder is true. Yeah, he's amazing man who knows more than you'd ever want to know. I would really recommend this documentary because it has a documentary called Orphan by West, or West by Orphan, I can't remember the name right now, but it's on Amazon Prime for free. And it tells his story of Emily, his grandmother, coming to the state of Wisconsin. Oh yeah, the other thing about the train, about the Bayfield being about the only place, I think that's true. Some of that was because, and it was later in the orphan train movement that the children that came to Bayfield did, because that was one of the last stops that the railroad expansion made. They were very slow to get to Bayfield and complete that. But because Bayfield is so kind of strategically placed by the water and other sorts of travel, that was considered ideal once the trains came there. Otherwise, most of the children were down in the south and southwest part of the state, primarily because those had already been established farming communities by that point. That's what I know. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mike, you want to
One more.
add one more thought? Okay.
I might add that Stephanie was listed on, I think, my third page as one of the people who has studied and made some very important observations about the orphan train movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is some of my favorite part of Tony Woiak situations is when we can all talk with one another. And before I ask you to thank Mike one more time, I just want to remind you he can stick around for a while, but he'll be headed to the back of the room so that we won't trip anybody up as we try to dismantle the equipment. So thank you all one more time for coming.